Hello and welcome to Lecture 5, Who Gains and Who Loses from Trade. This comes from Chapter 5 of your book. So we're going to be talking about first the short-run effects of opening trade. In the short run, with factors of production tied to their current lines of production, gains and losses are divided by output sectors. So factors of production such as labor and land, they're typically tied to their current lines of production. So whether it's wheat or cloth, they're typically in the short run tied to those lines. They don't change that quickly. Gains and losses are divided by output sector. All factors tied to rising sectors gain, and all factors tied to declining sectors lose. We'll talk about this a little bit more. In the US, owners of land and labor in wheat sector are expected to gain, and owners of the land and labor in the cloth sector are expected to lose. Remember, the US has a comparative advantage in wheat, and so when trade opens up, they'll export wheat, they'll produce less cloth, and they'll import cloth. And so the owners of the land and labor in wheat will gain, and those owners of land, labor, and cloth in the US are expected to lose. But what about the long run? What happens in the long run to factor price, to the factor price response? So in the long run, factors can move between sectors. People can be trained who were working in the cloth industry to now work in producing wheat. So in the long run, factors can move between these sectors in response to differences in return. Also, in the long run, wage rates end up lower for all US workers and higher for all foreign workers, each relative to its level with no trade. All land rents end up higher in the US and lower in the rest of the world, each relative its original level with no trade. So why is that? Why would US workers' wages fall and those in the rest of the world, land rents end up higher in the US and lower in the rest of the world? And so the US wages decrease, rents go up. The rest of the world, we have wages increasing, but land rents going down. So let's look at why this is. Okay, so, and this is figure 5.1 for your book, and it shows how free trade affects income distribution in the long run. So we started with the first slide talking about the short run and then moved to the long run. So this chart ends up with the long run, and we'll look at the long run results. But let's start off. So our initial prices in the US, this is before trade. Wheat is cheap in relation to cloth. Remember, it took, you had 4 wheat for every unit of cloth. In the rest of the world, wheat was expensive in relation to cloth. So once trade opens up, we'll have a new world price for these products. The price of wheat will go up. The price of cloth will go down in the United States. In the rest of the world, the price of wheat will go down, but the price of cloth will go up. So the US is manufacturing more wheat and exporting it to the rest of the world. The rest of the world is manufacturing more cloth and exporting it to the US. So production responds to the prices. If the price of wheat goes up, because now the rest of the world is demanding some of America's cheaper wheat, then production in the US will produce more wheat and produce less cloth. And it's exactly the opposite in the rest of the world. We'll produce less wheat in the rest of the world, and they will produce more cloth to export to the US. So here's the crucial step here. National factor markets will change as a result. So for each unit of cloth sacrificed, remember our production possibility curve, we only have so many factors. So if we're producing more wheat, that means we have to produce less cloth. So for each unit of cloth sacrificed, many workers and a small amount of land are laid off. So workers and land are laid off Extra wheat demands fewer workers, but much land. So remember, producing wheat is land intensive, but less labor intensive. And it's exactly the opposite with cloth. Cloth is labor intensive, but not land intensive. So there are many workers laid off and a little bit of land. On the flip side, wheat will demand a lot more land, but just a few workers. We look at the relationship in the rest of the world for each unit of wheat sacrifice. So they're going to stop producing some wheat, much land, and a few workers are laid off. Extra cloth demands many workers, but little land. So national factor prices will respond as a result. Because a lot of land is needed, but not as many workers are needed, wage rates will fall and rents will rise. In the rest of the world, we'll see because they need more workers, but they don't need all that much more land, wage rates will rise and rents will fall. So in the long run results, we see product prices are equalized between countries. We get the world price. Net gains, there are net gains for both countries, but different effects on different groups. So the winners are US landholders or landowners and foreign workers. So there's a higher demand for US land and a higher demand for foreign workers. The losers are US workers who have lower wages and foreign landowners because less land is needed. So this is the long run effect with trade. So this table just restates what we looked at, but it first looks at the short run. What happens in the short run and then the long run. We just went over what happens in the long run, but we'll touch upon it again. So the effects of free trade in the short run, in the United States, in the short run, because they'll start to produce more wheat, there will be gains both in landowners and laborers. There will be a shortage of farmers who know how to grow wheat, so there'll be gain and gain there. In cloth, because there's less cloth purchased, the landowners who are supplying land for clothing manufacturers and the laborers who produce the cloth will both lose. And it's exactly the opposite in the rest of the world. So for the wheat producers, it's lose-lose, and in cloth, it's gain-gain. But in the long run, we see that landowners gain because the land that was being used for cloth, the wheat producers will need it. And so it'll be gain-gain for landowners, but lose-lose for laborers because we don't need as many laborers for wheat. And because less cloth is being produced, we don't need as many laborers there. And on the flip side, in the rest of the world, laborers are the ones that gain. Since there's less land needed, they both lose. So that's what happens in the long run. You'll remember we discussed the Heckscher-Ohlin model in lecture 4. And we're going to continue on discussing that and see how it relates to what we've already discussed here in lecture 5. So there are 3 implications of the Heckscher-Ohlin model. The first one is the Stolper-Samuels theorem. We have the second, the specialized factor pattern, and finally, the factor price equalization theorem. So let's jump into each of these. So the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, it states that given certain conditions and assumptions, including full adjustment to a new long-run equilibrium, an event that changes relative product prices in a country unambiguously has 2 effects. So we're talking about the long run, not in the short run. It raises the real return to the factor used intensively in the rising price industry. So we saw this in the former charts. The factor that is used intensively in the rising price industry is land for America, wheat. So we're going to see a rise in the real return to that factor. However, it lowers the real return to the factor used intensively in the falling price industry. So for the production of cloth, labor was the intensively used factor, and so we'll see lower real returns to that factor. Okay, so that's the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, and we see that as we look at the tables and charts that we're looking at. Okay, now for the specialized factor pattern. It states that the more a factor is specialized and concentrated in the production of a product whose relative price is rising, the more this factor stands to gain. So specialization, the more it is specialized and concentrated in the production of a product, the more this factor stands to gain. So the more a factor is specialized and concentrated in the production of a product whose relative price is falling, such as cloth in the US, the more it stands to lose from the change in product price. So when there's more specialization, it has more to gain in a rising price environment, but more to lose in falling price environment. Finally, the factor price equalization theorem. This theorem states that given certain conditions and assumptions, free trade equalizes not only product prices, but also the prices of individual factors between the two countries. So to see what this means, consider our standard example of free trade in cloth and wheat. The theorem predicts that even if factors cannot migrate between countries directly with free trade, laborers of the same skill will earn the same wage in both countries. Units of land of comparable quality earn the same rental return in both countries. So same skill level or same quality, the factor price equalization theorem says that eventually that these factors will be equal. There will be an equalization in the price or the value of these factors. The factor price equalization theorem implies that laborers will end up earning the same wage rate in all countries, even if labor migration between countries is not allowed. Trade makes this possible within the assumptions of the model because the factors that cannot migrate between countries end up being implicitly shipped between countries in commodity form. And so the factors going into those commodities, such as wheat or cloth, labor being one of them, will affect the prices of those factors over time. So the question, does the Heckscher-Ohlin model explain actual trade patterns? The Heckscher-Ohlin approach to trade provides important insights in theory about the gains from trade, the effects of trade on production and consumption, and the effects of trade on the incomes of production factors, those things going into the production of the products. These insights are based on the hunch by Heckscher and Ohlin about the basis for trade, why countries export some products and import others. So the first formal efforts to test the HO theory, so up to this point, it's been a theory. So what we need, whenever there's a theory, we need somebody to empirically test these theories. So the first formal efforts to test the HO theory use the simple model of two factors of production and US trade data. These tests failed to confirm the HO theory. So empirically, these original tests were not able to show that the HO theory was accurate. More recent tests, however, recognize that more than two types of production factors are relevant to the HO explanation of trade patterns. Economists have tested the HO theory in several ways. Complete tests, however, require information on the factor endowments of different countries. So do they have extra land? Do they have an abundant supply of labor? What are their factor endowments? Also the international trade for various products. And finally, the factor proportions used in producing these products. As we looked at wheat, it requires a lot more land than it does labor. This table shows the shares of the world's factor endowments. This is between 2010 and 2011. So let's pick on the United States and China here. Okay, so we've got different factor endowments. You can see physical capital. China's a little bit higher in physical capital. Highly skilled labor 19 versus China's 12.2. Medium skilled labor, look at this, 3.9 versus 27.8. Also the unskilled labor, China has that in abundance. Cropland, US has got a little bit more cropland, but pasture land, China's got a bit more pasture land. You can see the US also has more forests. So how does this affect international trade? If Heckscher and Olin have given us the right prediction, the unequal distribution of factors should be mirrored in the patterns of trade, with each country exporting those goods and services that use its abundant factors relatively intensively. This shows the US international trade in selected products in 2012. So you can see wheat, which is what we've been talking about. We've got 8.17 billion in exports, a little bit of imports, but the net export as a percent of total trade is 81%. That's huge. Also, we do the same thing with corn. However, because of our climate, we need to import coffee, and you can see we import a lot of soybeans in 2012. So this shows these different products and that they're consistent with the HO theory. The way that we're trading with these products is consistent with the HO theory. This one shows the international trade in selected products in 2012. And these are products whose trade appears to be inconsistent with the HO theory. So pharmaceuticals, you can see we're importing a lot more pharmaceuticals, but we had highly skilled labor and those physical inputs. So why are we importing so much? Perfumes and cosmetics, you can see iron and steel. These tend to go against the HO theory. So what are the export-oriented and import competing factors? So this is the US pattern. So we've got factor content of each 1 million of exports. So these are our exports, and these are our imports. So the factor content, that means what factors went into the products and services that we are exporting and what factors went into the products and services we are importing. So you can see we have a certain amount of unskilled labor that went into producing things that we export. When compared to our imports, though, we see a higher amount of unskilled labor going into those products. Skilled labor, again, this is something that was abundant for the United States versus skilled labor of those things that we import. Capital, such as plant, equipment, and inventories, are less than those that we import. We have more farmland rents, but less mineral rights. So this is the US pattern. Here's the Canadian pattern. You can see similar in unskilled labor, but in skilled labor, they're importing a lot that require factor inputs of skilled labor, less capital that they're importing. So their production of exports required more capital than those that they're importing, required more farmland and forests than those that they're importing, and require more mineral rights than those that they import. So those products and services that require skilled labor tend to be what Canada is importing most. So, do factor prices equalize internationally? Factor prices clearly are not fully equalized across countries. The factor price equalization theorem is based on a number of assumptions, and some of these do not hold in the real world. So a weaker form of the theorem works better. International trade tends to make the prices of factors more similar across countries. So while we may not get to be exactly the same, it'll drive us towards similarities. So factors in one country might come down in price, while factors in another country might come up in price, getting us closer to the same, but not exactly. For example, the rapid increase in real wages for factory workers in China. We've seen that as China's exported more and more. We've seen these real wages come up in China, getting closer, still a ways off, but getting closer to the rest of the world in real wages for factory workers. So let's take a look at China. China's exports and imports. One of the most striking features of the global economy is the rise of China as a trading force after it opened to international trade beginning in the 1970s. China accounted for less than 1% of the international trade in 1980. Its exports and imports have grown rapidly so that by 2012, China's trade was about 9% of world trade. That is a significantly huge increase over a very short period of time, relatively. So first, its trade has been roughly balanced. The value of exports has roughly equaled the value of imports, even though both are growing rapidly. So while we've seen China's exports flood the US markets, they are importing as much as they're exporting. Second, much of its pattern of net exports and net imports of different products is just what Heckscher and Olin would predict. So this chart shows the value of exports and the value of imports for China from 1976 to 2012. So you can see it was virtually nothing in the 70s, but we've seen a steady and almost exponential rise. You can see this downturn. This was the last recession that we had, 2007, 2008, 2009. I imagine if we could see this in 2020, we'd see something similar because of the COVID-19 crisis. Here are China's international trade in 2012. You can see their exports versus imports. So they're importing a lot of soybeans, metal ores, crude petroleum, metalworking machinery. They are exporting a lot of computers, audio equipment, importing electronic microcircuits, aircraft, exporting clothing and accessories, shoes and other footwear, toys, vegetables. Textile and leather machinery is about even. So I don't think any of these are any surprise to any of us, but these are the numbers behind China's international trade as of 2012. That is the end of this lecture on who gains and who loses from trade. I hope it helped make it a little more clear. I encourage you, if you haven't already read the chapter, to please read the chapter. It'll dive a lot more deeper into the topics that we covered and have a little bit more there. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me during my office hours. If my office hours don't work for you, please email me and we can schedule a time that will work. Thank you very much.